When you fly across the country, clutching a carry-on full of presents for your mother, you never imagine a stranger will open the front door of your childhood home, look you dead in the eyes, and say, "I don't know who you are. I live here now." But that's exactly what happened to me. My name is Jessica Carter. I'm 34, a lawyer in New York, and I thought nothing could surprise me anymore, not after the family I grew up in. Still, I was wrong. I'll never forget the way she said it. So calm, so matter of fact. Standing in the doorway of the house, my father built the house. My mother swore she'd never leave. For a moment, I just stood there on that familiar porch, my suitcase heavy in one hand, a bag of carefully wrapped gifts in the other. The world seemed to tilt sideways. The woman's words didn't make sense, but her tone left no room for argument. This wasn't just a mistake. This was my nightmare, standing there in broad daylight. I took a slow breath. I didn't yell. I didn't panic. Instead, I did what any lawyer would do. I reached for my phone and dialed my mom, expecting her to clear things up in seconds. But when she picked up and told me she was waiting for me at home, my heart dropped. I told her I was at the house. She insisted she was there, too, except she wasn't. Suddenly, it hit me I wasn't just dealing with a misunderstanding. Something was deeply, dangerously wrong. My childhood home was gone, and my mother wasn't where she was supposed to be. If you think this sounds like the start of some true crime show, you're not wrong. But this isn't a story about strangers. It's about family. It's about betrayal so deep. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the people I grew up with. What happened next would shatter every illusion I still had about loyalty, trust, and what it means to belong. But before I take you inside the story, before I show you how I turned the tables on the very people who thought they could erase me, make sure you hit subscribe. Drop a like if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family. And if you think your story is wild, wait until you hear how mine ended up on the evening news. Now, let me introduce myself. I'm Jessica, the one who was always called the responsible one, the fixer, the person everyone relied on, until the day my family decided I was disposable. What they didn't realize was that I don't break, I build cases. And this time, I was building one against my own blood. Let's start at the beginning. Back then, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was being forgotten. Turns out, being erased is much more personal. Before it all fell apart, we looked like any other family chasing the American dream. But if you looked closer, you'd see the cracks. And the first signs of trouble didn't show up on that porch. They started a long time ago. Growing up, my family always seemed perfectly ordinary from the outside. Our house in Palo Alto was the kind of place realtors dream about: a 2-story craftsman with bay windows, rose bushes along the front walk, and the feeling that if you just worked hard enough, you too could have a slice of the American dream. But the truth is, there's nothing safe about a house if what's inside it is slowly breaking apart. My mother, Linda, is the kind of person who sees the best in everyone. She's gentle, soft-spoken, and would rather lose an argument than hurt someone's feelings. She married my stepdad, Rick, when I was 7. He was charming, successful in business, always surrounded by people who seemed to laugh a little too hard at his jokes. I tried for years to win his approval, but Rick made it clear, in 100 small ways, that I would always be on the outside looking in. Then there was Ashley, my younger sister, by 3 years. She was always the star, the one who could do no wrong. Teachers loved her. My mother doted on her, and Rick treated her like his own daughter. My brother, Brandon, came along a couple of years later. He grew up idolizing Rick. soaking up every lesson about ambition and appearances. The three of them, plus my mother, seemed like a perfect unit. I always felt a little bit like the family's shadow, expected to succeed, but never allowed to shine. Looking back, I can see how the pattern started. When something went missing, the blame landed on me. If a vase broke or someone got their feelings hurt, it was Jessica's fault. Rick never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He planted ideas in my mother's mind, quiet suggestions that grew into doubts. Over time, I learned to anticipate accusations, to tiptoe around the house, to brace myself for another silent judgment. When I was 20, I left California for college on the East Coast. I worked 2 jobs, took out student loans, and pushed myself through law school while my siblings stayed close to home. I thought if I built a successful life on my own, maybe things would change. Maybe my family would finally see me for who I was. I became a lawyer in New York, built my own name, and sent money home whenever my mother needed it. Even from across the country, I tried to keep that fragile connection alive. For a while, things seemed to settle. My mother and I talked often. I visited whenever I could, always making time for birthdays and holidays. But over the last year, I started to notice something shifting. My mother's calls grew shorter. She'd mentioned that she was busy helping Ashley or running errands with Brandon. Sometimes she sounded distracted, or tired, or just distant. I told myself she was getting older, that maybe she was overwhelmed with everything going on. I had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. I didn't know that my own family was quietly rewriting me out of the story, one careful step at a time. I'd spent years thinking I could fix things by working harder, by being more patient, by proving myself over and over again. But that's not how family dynamics work, especially not in a family where old wounds go unspoken and loyalty is used like a weapon. When I got off that plane in California, I was determined to reconnect with my mom, to remind her that she still mattered to me. I never expected to find that everything I thought was safe had already been taken away. As I stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the house that was supposed to be home, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. I didn't know it yet, but the little clues, the shorter calls, the missing warmth, the way my mother's voice trembled when I told her I'd arrived, were warning signs. I just hadn't put the pieces together. Not yet. But I was about to. What happened next would take everything I thought I understood about family and turn it inside out. If you think betrayal is just a moment, a single, sharp break, you've never watched it unfold slowly, piece by piece, until you realize you're the last to know the truth. After the shock on my mother's doorstep, I knew nothing about this trip would be simple. But it wasn't until I called her that the real confusion began. My mom's voice on the phone was so normal, almost cheerful, as she insisted she was at home, waiting for me. But she was nowhere near the house where I was standing. It didn't make sense. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked for her address. She rattled off a street name I had never heard before, an apartment complex on the other side of San Jose. My heart sank. Palo Alto and San Jose might as well be different worlds. I ordered a rideshare and tried to ignore the dread growing in my chest as the car drove further away from everything familiar. When I finally arrived, my mother opened the door to a tiny apartment with peeling paint, a battered sofa, and a single window that looked out on a parking lot full of broken-down cars. She was smaller than I remembered, almost swallowed up by the cramped space. Her smile faltered when she saw me, but she recovered quickly, asking about my flight, offering me tea like nothing was wrong. It took only a few minutes to realize something was very wrong. My mother believed she had moved here because I told her to. She pulled out her phone and showed me a string of messages, my name, my photo, but not my number, telling her it was for the best that Ashley and Brandon handle things, that she should trust them with the family home. I read the messages in disbelief. They were cold, formal, nothing like the way I actually speak. And more than that, I had never sent them. When I tried to explain this, my mother looked confused, then defensive. She said, "Your brother and sister set up everything. They told me this was your new number. They said you were too busy, that you just wanted to make things easier for me." Suddenly, years of feeling like the outsider clicked into place. My siblings had always managed to twist reality, to present me as the difficult one. Now they'd gone further than I ever thought possible. They had literally rewritten my identity using technology I barely understood to push my mother out of her own home. As I kept digging, the scale of what they'd done hit me like a freight train. Our old house had been rented out legally, on paper. The lease had my forged signature. When I confronted my mom with the paperwork, she stared at it in shock. "But I thought you approved it," she whispered. "Ashley told me you arranged everything from New York. She even showed me videos of you explaining it." That's when I realized how deep the deception went. My sister was an influencer, always playing with the latest tech trends. She had used deepfake videos, fake recordings of my face and voice, to convince our mother that I had orchestrated the whole thing. My brother, ever the tech wizard, had set up fake emails, redirected accounts, handled the money. As I pieced it together, I learned the rent payments over $150,000 in less than a year had all gone into Ashley's account. Not only that, but my mother's credit was ruined. Her name had been used to take out loans, to pay off Rick's endless debts from his failed businesses and bad investments. The house was gone. The money was gone. And, worst of all, my mother still wanted to believe that Ashley and Brandon were helping. It was humiliating. Neighbors had started to gossip about what happened to Linda, how she'd ended up in public housing while her kids lived comfortably. My mother's pride kept her silent, even as everything she'd worked for disappeared. Standing there in that cramped apartment, I realized I couldn't fix things with kindness or patience. I couldn't win my family back by being understanding. I was up against something systematic, planned, and brutally efficient. All my life, I'd been told to keep the peace, not to make waves. But at that moment, watching my mother struggle to make sense of the betrayal, I knew those days were over. This was bigger than hurt feelings or old family grudges. This was criminal. This was personal. And so I made a decision. If my family wanted to erase me from their story, I would write myself back in this time, on my own terms. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in the spare bed, listening to the sounds of neighbors drifting through thin apartment walls. I thought about all the times I'd tried to keep the peace, the years I spent hoping that if I worked hard enough, loved enough, or forgave enough, my family would finally see me. But sitting in that cramped room, with my mother lost and bewildered, I realized I couldn't keep playing the role of the good daughter. Not when the cost was everything she'd ever worked for. Not when the truth was this ugly. In the morning, I made coffee in a chipped mug, sitting across from my mother as sunlight leaked through faded curtains. I asked gentle questions, nothing too direct, nothing that might make her defensive. Little by little, I mapped out how it had all happened. Ashley and Brandon had handled everything. They set up her new phone, convinced her to sign documents she couldn't read, assured her it was for her own good, and every step was backed up by proof messages, emails, even video calls that looked and sounded like me, but weren't. It was methodical. It was cold. And it was a kind of betrayal I never imagined my own siblings would be capable of. But anger wouldn't be enough. If I wanted justice, I needed proof. I needed a plan that was airtight, the way I'd build a case for any client facing this kind of fraud. So I did what I do best. I started gathering evidence. I asked my mother for every document she could find. The fake lease, emails from Ashley and Brandon, screenshots of WhatsApp messages. I checked the metadata on videos. I compared signatures. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This was no amateur scam. They'd used deepfake technology to make videos of me instructing my mother to trust them. The paperwork was notarized. But when I called, the notary listed. She told me she'd never met my mother or anyone named Carter. For that matter, it was classic identity theft, carried out by people who knew exactly how to manipulate the system and their own mother. The amount missing was staggering. In less than 1 year, more than $150,000 had disappeared, funneled straight into Ashley's account, and spent just as quickly on influencer photo shoots, luxury vacations, and endless bailouts for Rick's failed businesses. Even worse, they'd taken out loans in my mother's name, destroying her credit, leaving her trapped in that rundown apartment with nothing but memories of the life she'd lost. The anger that had simmered in me for years began to crystallize into something sharper. I wasn't just going to get justice for my mother. I was going to make sure no one could ever do this to her or anyone else again. The first step was legal. I called a friend from law school who specialized in elder fraud and identity theft. We talked through the evidence, outlined a strategy, and she agreed to help pro bono. I contacted a digital forensics expert, someone who could verify that the videos my siblings used were manipulated, that the messages were sent from devices not connected to me. Next, I opened a case with the police, presenting every document, every email, every bank transfer. I was careful. I knew that if I made one wrong move, my siblings would circle the wagons, delete evidence, and make it impossible to recover what my mother had lost. But I didn't just want to fight this in the shadows. I wanted accountability. And I knew public pressure could do what courts sometimes couldn't. So I started documenting everything. I wrote out a timeline. I took screenshots. I made copies of every file, every statement, and then I reached out to the local news. I told them the truth. A well-known influencer in the Bay Area was under investigation for defrauding her own mother and older sister out of more than $150,000. Using deepfake technology and identity theft, they were interested immediately. This was bigger than a family spat. This was a story about technology, trust, and how even the smartest people can be targeted when the criminals are family. I crafted my statement carefully. I left out names at first, but the facts spoke for themselves. The fake documents, the financial records, the ruined credit, the trail of money. I sent the story to a journalist who covered tech and family law. I knew if the pressure got high enough, Ashley's sponsors and followers would see her for who she really was. Meanwhile, my law school friend helped me draft a cease and desist letter. We demanded the immediate return of all funds, restoration of my mother's credit, and the cancellation of any fraudulent loans or accounts. If Ashley and Brandon refused, we'd proceed with a lawsuit for fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. I had the law on my side now. I had the media ready to expose the truth. And for the first time in my life, I felt the balance of power begin to shift. Still, I knew my siblings. I knew they would deny everything, claim it was all a misunderstanding, maybe even blame my mother's confusion or my ambition. That was their playbook: gaslight, distract, and avoid responsibility. But this time, I was ready for every excuse. I was done begging for acceptance. I was done letting loyalty become a leash. As the investigation built momentum, I reached out to a few neighbors who had always been kind to my mother. I asked them if they'd noticed anything strange in the past year. Any changes? Any stories about Ashley or Brandon handling family business? Their answers lined up perfectly with what I'd discovered. One neighbor remembered seeing Ashley's car in the driveway the week my mother moved out. Another had heard Brandon boasting at a barbecue about his new side hustle managing properties. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. My mother watched me work with a mixture of fear and hope. She'd spent months blaming herself, thinking she'd failed, or that I'd abandoned her. Now, as she saw me collect evidence, make phone calls, build a real case, I could see the old spark return to her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she believed someone was on her side. The day I submitted the case file to the district attorney, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I'd carried the weight of being the family scapegoat, the outsider. But now, I realized the same skills that had kept me on the outside: my stubbornness, my need for truth, my refusal to accept easy answers were exactly what my mother needed. For the first time, I was fighting for her, not just for peace. As I waited for the legal process to begin, I prepared for the confrontation I knew was coming. Ashley and Brandon wouldn't go down quietly. Rick, always the survivor, would find some way to justify what they'd done. But I was no longer afraid of their anger or their judgment. I had something stronger. I had the truth, and I had the law on my side. The next step was execution. If my family wanted a war, I was ready to bring it. What came next would test every ounce of courage I had. But I wasn't backing down, not now. Not ever. The day I set my plan in motion, I felt an unfamiliar sense of control. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting, I was driving the action. Every move I made was deliberate. There was no more hoping for fairness. No more waiting for my siblings to admit what they'd done. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter the fallout. First, I confronted Ashley and Brandon face to face. We met at Ashley's apartment, a place that was more photo studio than home ring lights. Brand logos, endless racks of designer clothes. She opened the door wearing her influencer smile, but I could see the nerves behind her eyes. Brandon tried to keep things light, asking about my flight, but I cut straight to the point. I laid the evidence out on the coffee table. Copies of the fake lease, screenshots of messages, a summary of the bank transfers. Ashley's face drained of color as she realized how much I knew. I told them about the forensic proof, the notary's statement, the pending police report, and the open case with the district attorney. For once, neither of them had a comeback. Ashley tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, just helping Mom. But her voice shook. Brandon stayed silent, glancing between us, searching for an escape that didn't exist. I kept my tone even and firm. I made it clear. Either they returned every penny, restored our mother's credit, and moved out of the house immediately, or I would take it all public, and I meant public in the biggest way possible. When they hesitated, I gave them a preview. I pulled out my phone and opened my Twitter app, reading aloud the first lines of a thread I drafted. How my family used deepfake technology to steal more than $150,000 from our own mother. Ashley's hand trembled. She knew what going viral for the wrong reason could do. Her brand deals would disappear overnight. Brandon's reputation in the tech world would be ruined. Rick's financial messes would finally be exposed. But it wasn't just a threat. I hit publish before they could answer. Within minutes, the thread started to spread. The screenshots, the receipts. The story, people were shocked. Some of Ashley's followers defended her at first. But as the evidence stacked up, the mood shifted. Brands reached out, asking for statements. A local news reporter messaged me, eager for an interview. That was just the beginning. I followed up with a press release to the local ABC affiliate. Soon, There were news vans parked outside the old house. The neighbors, who'd whispered about my mother for months, now watched as the story unfolded on television. Suddenly, what my siblings had tried to hide became the talk of the town, and not in the way they'd planned. Back at my mother's apartment, I walked her through every update, making sure she understood each step. It wasn't easy. She cried when she saw her name trending online, afraid people would judge her or think she'd been careless. But as supportive comments poured in, people sharing their own stories of family betrayal and financial abuse, she began to see she wasn't alone. The shame started to lift. Meanwhile, the consequences for Ashley and Brandon came quickly. Ashley's main sponsor, a national beauty brand, dropped her within 48 hours. 2 more followed by the end of the week. Her carefully built image as a family values influencer crumbled. Brandon's tech job was put under review after his employer learned about the investigation. Rick, who'd been hiding behind everyone else, was suddenly the focus of an official audit. Investigators uncovered years of unpaid debts and questionable transfers money that had vanished the moment it hit his account. It didn't stop there. The district attorney's office froze the joint accounts Ashley and Brandon had used to move the money. The bank flagged suspicious loans and began working to restore my mother's credit. The notary who'd unknowingly been impersonated helped us shut down any documents filed in her name. Throughout it all, I stayed visible. I answered every reporter, posted regular updates, and made sure the facts were crystal clear. I didn't hide behind legal language. I spoke from the heart about what it means to lose trust in your own family, and about how technology can be used for harm just as easily as for good. People paid attention. A local support group for elder fraud survivors reached out to my mother, offering resources and a community. Legal advocates offered to help us with ongoing credit repair. The police continued their investigation, and the case was strong enough that charges for fraud and elder abuse looked likely. The final confrontation with Rick happened in a law office, with my attorney present and a police officer on standby. Rick tried to talk circles, blaming the economy, blaming bad luck, even blaming my mother's poor judgment. I shut him down. I listed every fact, every dollar, every lie. When he realized he was cornered, he slumped in his chair and finally agreed to sign over what was left of the assets. Afterwards, my mother looked at me, relief and disbelief written across her face. "How did you do it?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand and told her the truth. I just stopped letting them write the story. I took the pen back. It was not revenge for the sake of revenge. It was justice. And for the first time, I saw the family roles reverse. Ashley and Brandon were left scrambling, exposed, and isolated. Rick faced the consequences he'd dodged for years. And my mother, for the first time in a long while, felt safe again. But victory isn't just about what you win. It's about how you live after the dust settles. And as the headlines faded, the real healing began. As the scandal exploded online and in the community, the fallout came faster than I could have imagined. Within days, Ashley's social media following dropped by tens of thousands. Sponsors cut ties without a second thought, and she posted a tearful apology video that only made things worse. The comments were brutal. Some people accused her of being a monster. Others shared their own stories of betrayal. She tried to defend herself at first, blaming miscommunication and family drama. But no one was buying it. Brandon fared no better. The tech company he worked for put him on indefinite leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. His friends, who had once bragged about knowing a Silicon Valley rising star, stopped answering his calls. Even old high school buddies distanced themselves as the headlines kept coming. His confidence, once so unshakable, seemed to vanish overnight. Rick was the last to fall. The audit uncovered a pattern of financial mismanagement stretching back years. Creditors began showing up at his door, demanding repayment. The local paper ran a feature about elder fraud, quoting legal experts and calling Rick's actions a textbook case of financial abuse. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore, not even the people who used to rely on his connections. For a man who had built his entire life on charm and appearances, the public humiliation was almost too much to bear. Meanwhile, my mother was finally able to move back into her home. The process took time, weeks of paperwork, meetings with the bank, and long conversations with the credit union. I stayed by her side for every step, determined that she would never feel alone in a room full of lawyers or bankers again. The neighbors, who had once gossiped behind her back, now showed up with casseroles and cards, offering genuine support. A few even apologized for not reaching out sooner. It was a strange feeling, walking through the old house again. At first, every room was a reminder of what we had lost. The living room where we once celebrated birthdays. The kitchen where my mother taught us how to bake. Each space held memories, both joyful and painful. But as the days passed, those memories softened. My mother repainted the walls, replaced old furniture, and hung new photos. The house began to feel like home again. Not a monument to betrayal, but a place where something new could grow. For me, the sense of relief was mixed with exhaustion. The battle had been long and ugly. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the weight of family shame threatened to pull me under. But each time, I saw my mother smile. Genuinely smile. I knew it was worth it. She began to join community events, volunteered at the local library, and slowly regained the confidence she'd lost. The support from online communities, strangers who reached out after reading our story, meant more to her than she could ever say. As for Ashley and Brandon, their reputations never recovered. Ashley's influencer career was over. The companies that had once courted her now avoided her entirely. Brandon tried to start over in a different city, but the digital trail of what he'd done followed him everywhere. Rick, left with mounting debts, and no one left to manipulate, eventually moved away. I heard he tried to rebuild his life in another state, but I didn't care enough to follow the details. That chapter, for me, was closed. The most surprising consequence was the way our story resonated far beyond our neighborhood. Advocacy groups used our case as an example of how modern technology could be weaponized inside families. I was invited to speak at a panel on financial abuse, sharing what I had learned about spotting red flags and standing up for yourself even against people you once trusted most. Healing didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks nights when old anxieties crept in, days when my mother flinched at unexpected mail or unfamiliar phone numbers. But with time, those fears faded. We found new routines. We built new memories. My mother and I grew closer than we had ever been, bonded not just by blood, but by survival. Through it all, I kept reminding myself why I had fought so hard. Justice, in the end, isn't about punishing those who hurt you. It's about restoring what was lost: dignity, safety, hope, and for the first time in years, I finally felt all three. But the real lesson didn't come from the fight itself. It came from what happened next, as life slowly returned to something that felt almost normal. And I began to wonder what it really means to move forward after the storm. As the headlines faded and our lives returned to a slower rhythm, I started to realize that victory, real victory, is quieter than you might expect. There were no fireworks, no dramatic final confrontation that fixed everything overnight. Instead, what lingered was a new sense of space, a room inside me where fear had once lived, now filled with something steadier. Peace is not loud, but it is powerful. Looking back, I can see that justice is not a single event. It's a series of choices, made one after another, sometimes in the dark, often when you feel completely alone. For me, the fight for my mother's safety and dignity forced me to let go of who I thought my family was. It meant letting the truth come out, even when it was ugly, even when it meant exposing people I'd once loved. People sometimes ask if I regret going public, if I regret bringing my family's secrets into the light. But the truth is, hiding never protected us. Silence only helped the ones who did harm. The day I published our story online, I was terrified. Terrified of what people would say. Terrified that no one would believe us. What I discovered was the opposite. For every cruel comment, there were 100 voices reaching out to say, "Me too." We were not alone. There are thousands, maybe millions of people living with the same wounds, the same confusion, the same longing for justice in their own families. My mother's life is quieter now. She grows tomatoes in the backyard, helps out at the library, and hosts Sunday dinners that are smaller but filled with laughter. She is no longer haunted by what she lost. She talks to neighbors who once kept their distance, now eager to share a cup of coffee or ask about her garden. The woman who once apologized for taking up space now walks with her head held high. As for me, I never planned to become an advocate. But the more I shared, the more people reached out, asking for advice, for help, for a listening ear. I joined a support network for people who'd survived family fraud. I spoke at community centers and online forums, telling our story not because it was unique, but because it was, unfortunately, so common. I learned that you can take your pain and turn it into something that might help someone else survive their own storm. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Ashley and Brandon. I wonder if they understand the damage they did, not just to our mother, but to themselves. I wonder if Rick ever looks back and wishes he had chosen differently. I will probably never know. What I do know is that forgiveness, if it comes, will have to be earned. Some wounds close with time, some with distance, and some with a simple, everyday choice to keep living on your own terms. If you're listening to this and recognizing some part of your own life, maybe a betrayal, maybe a secret, maybe a hurt you were told to ignore, I want you to know you are not alone. Justice might look different for each of us. Sometimes it's a courtroom. Sometimes it's a story told in the open. Sometimes it's just the act of standing up and saying, "This is not okay. You deserve safety, and peace, and dignity, no matter what anyone else says." So here's what I learned. You cannot always save the family you're born into, but you can build something better from the ashes. You can find your voice. You can fight for the people who matter. And you can reclaim your story. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in these words, share your experience in the comments below. Let others know they're not alone. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe for more stories about choosing yourself, standing up to betrayal, and finding your way home. No matter where you started, healing is not linear, but it is possible. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is simply keep going. Thank you for listening.